Hello, and welcome to our three-part series about Europe in the Middle Ages. Our first lesson will focus on feudalism and life in medieval Europe. The Middle Ages in Europe actually spans quite a long time, roughly about 1,000 years worth of time. The early Middle Ages spans from when Rome falls around 500 CE to 1000 CE. The High Middle Ages covers most of the Crusades period from around 1000 to 1250. And then the Late Middle Ages covers from 1250 to 1500 as Europe experiences the plague and starts shifting towards the Renaissance. The Middle Ages are also sometimes referred to as the Dark Ages, basically because it was a dark time for learning. There is no new thought going on, no new technology, and no new innovation. Let's look at the map on the screen. As you can see, after the Roman Empire fell, the right side, the one pictured in blue on the screen, became the Byzantine Empire, and the colorful left side represents the feudal kingdoms that came after the fall of Rome. As you can see, they are broken up into regions kind of based off of the groups that conquered them. Like the Franks take over Gaul, and the combination of those two groups is what will make up the demographics of present-day French people. These regional kingdoms do not have any sense of loyalty to each other than the fact that they are all Roman Catholic Christians. The Church in Europe was the most powerful force, more powerful than any government system. The Church will actually control about 1/3 of the land in Western Europe. They did this by promising landholders that if they left their land to the Church when they died, that they would basically gain immediate entrance into heaven. Abuses to the Church teachings like this one will become a common occurrence in medieval Europe, and will eventually lead to another break in the Catholic Church. You have to remember, in the medieval Church, not all priests are there because they want to serve God wholeheartedly. Many priests saw this as a way for them to gain power, and many rules were thrown to the wayside. For example, many popes during the Middle Ages actually had not-so-secret families, and they acted more like kings rather than true spiritual leaders. It's kind of funny which rules the Church places specific importance on. For example, they tried to curb heresies like iconoclasm, or the use of icons in the church, which is what the Byzantines did. They're also going to heavily promote tithing, or giving 1/10 of your income to the church. This is another way that the church was able to gain resources and create the massive works of art and land holdings they're known for. The life of a monk during medieval times was very planned and regulated. As you can see from the chart on the screen, much of their day is spent in services and working. Monks such as these were the only source of knowledge for most medieval communities. In every monastery, they had a room called a scriptorium. Remember, Europe doesn't have any kind of printing press until the 1500s, so any book in existence was handwritten. Monks were the main producers of literature during this time. They mostly produced religious texts like the Bible, so some monks' only job was to sit and hand-copy the Bible all day long. So as you can imagine, books were very expensive to produce, and only very wealthy people would own them. Though it didn't matter much to the lower classes, because with no public school system, there were not any literate peasant people, so the fact that they didn't have any books really didn't matter to them. This is an example of an illuminated manuscript. Many Bibles during this time were printed with beautiful images such as this, especially on important stories. Even many higher-class people who could afford Bibles couldn't actually read them. Bibles are only printed in Latin, which only monks and dedicated scholars actually learned, so the pictures helped people understand which story was being told. Architecture during this time period also reflects the lack of imagination present in the Middle Ages. The building in the picture is a great example of Romanesque architecture. They had very thick walls, and their structure is very blocky and doesn't have much embellishment. They do have rounded arches and barrel vaults that add a little bit more dimension. Windows were usually very small and often at the top of the room's walls. There is also a belief that when you were sick, darkness was better than fresh air and light to help you get better. Another great example of poor medieval healthcare tips. You also have to consider the fact that glass was not in abundant supply, so windows were a luxury and most people couldn't afford large windows. Here is an example of a barrel vault. As you can see, it gets its name because the ceiling looks like you cut a barrel in half and made your ceiling out of it. So it does add a little bit more dimension to these very dark stone structures. Feudalism is the basic structure that will allow Europe to continue on for this 1,000-year time span. When the Roman Empire fell, many of these new kingdoms became much more self-contained. They no longer had access to long-distance trade routes, and therefore they began to figure out ways to become more self-sufficient. Feudalism is the system that developed. Feudalism is a political, economic, and social system based on loyalty and military service. As you can see from the social hierarchy graphic, most of the social classes are pretty similar to previous civilizations we have studied. Peasants, also called serfs, are at the bottom, and serfs are not allowed to leave the land they work on without the lord's permission. And in return for their service, they are offered protection and safety from the lord they serve. Up next are knights. Knights were very well trained and fought for the lords they served. They were paid for these services and sometimes granted small pieces of land. Above them are the lords and nobility. I would argue that lords often had more power than the king. The knights were loyal to them, more so than a king that they had never met, so a lord that became too powerful could really challenge a king's authority. The king technically owns all of the land, and he can take it back from the lords if he wants to, but again, this creates a very dangerous power dynamic. There are not many communities that develop outside of a manor like this one. The physical layout of the feudal system is called manorialism. As you can see from the image, the community centered around a large manor house where the lord and his family would live. The house would be surrounded by a high wall, and the villagers would go there if they needed protection. Surrounding the manor was the village community. Here would be serf living quarters, businesses like a blacksmith or a baker, and the agricultural fields would be nearby as well. Manor life produced a self-contained living system. There is no real class movement, so you always have just the right number of each type of class. Life on the manor was hard, and most serfs toiled very hard to grow crops or complete their assigned jobs. The average lifespan for a serf during this time period was only about 40 years of age. This is a picture of life on a manor in the 6th century. And this picture represents life on a manor in the 13th century. As you can see, nothing really has changed. Serfs are doing the same types of jobs they were, 800 years ago, and still have gained few legal rights. This is another good example of why this era is often referred to as the Dark Ages, as nothing new is happening. The last topic today is the exciting study of knights. You have probably heard the terms knight, squire, or page thrown around in movies, but I bet you don't know exactly what they are. A page is actually a young boy in training to be a knight. Knighthood was a great honor for many middle-class families, and knights could also be potentially from the noble families if they were a lower son from a large family. Pages would start being an apprentice for a knight around the age of 8. They would learn how to serve, basic reading and writing, fighting skills, and falconry. They would then be upgraded to a squire around the age of 13, and they would actually be able to travel and assist their knight in battle. Then, around the age of 18, they would become an actual knight. Knights were bound by a code of chivalry, which basically is a code of honor that made them always do the honorable thing. And it asked that they pledge an oath of fealty to their lord, promising that they would support him over any other ruler. This concludes our episode on feudalism and life in medieval Europe. Thanks for watching.